Businessman pays a stranger's debt and changes his destiny. Internal sabotage threatens to destroy the millionaire's empire. Faux secret from the past ties the helped man to his greatest challenge. An unlikely alliance becomes the only chance for salvation. Rain lashed against the bulletproof windows of the Cadillac Escalade as Richard Miller watched droplets stream down the glass. The digital clock read 11:47 p.m., and the streets of downtown Chicago seemed deserted, except for the occasional night watchman and homeless person seeking shelter under the awnings of commercial buildings. As CEO of Miller Enterprises, one of the largest business conglomerates in the United States, Richard was accustomed to long nights of work, but something about this particular night troubled him. The traffic light turned red, forcing him to stop at a dimly lit corner. That's when his eyes caught a scene that transported him decades into the past. A man, apparently in his 30s, was cornered by three intimidating figures. The expression of despair on his face was all too familiar to Richard. It was the same look his father had on that fateful night in 1985, when unscrupulous creditors threatened them. "Sir, do you want me to take another route?" asked Frank, his driver of over 15 years, noticing his boss's unease. Richard hesitated for a moment, his fingers drumming on the Italian leather seat. "No, Frank, stop the car." The driver shot a concerned look through the rearview mirror, but obeyed. Richard adjusted his Hermes tie and stepped out of the vehicle, ignoring the rain that began to soak his $15,000 Armani suit. "Gentlemen," his deep, authoritative voice cut through the damp night air, "can I help with something?" The three figures turned, surprised by the interruption. The cornered man took advantage of the distraction to lean against the wall, his legs visibly shaking. "This is none of your business, rich boy," growled the tallest of the three, taking a step toward Richard. Richard smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the same smile he used in hostile negotiations. "On the contrary, I'm making it my business now. How much does he owe?" The cornered man, who would later introduce himself as Paul Sanders, watched the scene with a mixture of fear and disbelief. His debt to loan sharks had grown exponentially in recent months after he lost his job and needed to pay for his daughter's treatment. 200 grand, the group's leader responded, still maintaining a threatening posture. Richard laughed, a humorless sound. 200,000? That's why you're threatening a man on a rainy night? He took his cell phone out of his pocket, making a quick call. "Diana? Yes, I need an immediate transfer. I'll give you the details." Minutes later, the group leader confirmed receipt of the money in his account. Richard watched as they walked away, disappearing into the rainy night as if they had never existed. Paul remained where he was, still trembling, now not just from fear, but also from confusion and relief. I don't know how to thank you, sir, but I have no way to pay." I'm not asking you to pay me," Richard interrupted him, studying the man before him. There was something familiar in his desperation, something that touched an old wound in his chest. "But I have a proposal for you. Show up tomorrow at 9 a.m. at the Miller Enterprises office on the 20th floor of the Hancock Tower. Ask for me at the reception." Without waiting for a response, Richard returned to his car, leaving Paul in the rain with a business card in his trembling hands. As the Cadillac drove away, Paul stared fixedly at the name engraved in gold letters on the card. Richard Miller, CEO, Miller Enterprises. What Paul didn't know, as he held that card as if it were a talisman, was that this seemingly fortuitous encounter would change not only his life, but also trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of the Miller empire. On that rainy night, both Richard and Paul were merely pawns in a much larger game, whose rules were beginning to be written in the shadows of American corporate power. 6 months had passed since that rainy night. Paul Sanders had become an exemplary employee in the financial department of Miller Enterprises, his dedication and analytical ability soon catching the attention of superiors. On his desk, a photo of his daughter Anna, now fully recovered, served as a constant reminder of the reason for his gratitude to Richard Miller. However, on that Monday morning, while organizing some old documents in the company's dead file, Paul found something that made his stomach churn. It was a yellowed folder dated 5 years ago, containing records of a company called Easy Credit LLC. The name awakened painful memories. It was the same company that had granted the initial loan that, through abusive interest rates and predatory clauses, had brought him to the brink of the abyss. With slightly trembling hands, Paul began to examine the documents. Each page revealed a deeper connection between Easy Credit and one of Miller Enterprises' subsidiaries. The loan shark company wasn't just an independent business. It was part of a complex network of shell companies that ultimately answered to Richard Miller himself. Sanders, the voice of his supervisor, Mary Adams, startled him. "What are you doing down here?" Paul quickly closed the folder, his heart racing. "Just organizing some old documents, Mary. I thought we might need to free up space here." Mary observed him with a penetrating look for a few seconds before nodding. "Well, when you're done, Mr. Miller wants to see you in his office. Seems there's a new special project in sight." As he rode the 20 floors up to the executive suite, Paul struggled with conflicting feelings. On one hand, he felt genuine gratitude toward Richard Miller. The man had saved not only his life but also his daughter's. On the other, the recent discovery suggested that the same man might have been indirectly responsible for his near ruin. The secretary led him into the imposing presidential office. Richard Miller was standing by the window, contemplating the city sprawling below. Hearing Paul enter, he turned with a cordial smile. "Paul, glad you could come. Please, sit down." Richard indicated one of the leather armchairs in front of his solid mahogany desk. "I've been following your work over the past few months. Your financial analysis skills are impressive." "Thank you, sir," Paul replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Actually, that's exactly why I called you here. We're facing some challenges in some of our subsidiaries. Financial inconsistencies, contracts that mysteriously disappear, questionable decisions. I need someone with your keen eye to investigate." Paul felt a chill down his spine. "Investigate, sir?" "Yes. Someone is trying to sabotage our operations, Paul, and I need to find out who it is." Richard leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Paul's. "You'll have full access to all necessary documents and systems. Naturally, this will come with a considerable increase in your salary." At that moment, Paul realized he was being placed in a unique position, a position that could both reveal the truth about the Miller Empire and destroy it from within. The irony didn't escape him. The man who possibly orchestrated his financial ruin years ago was now giving him the keys to the kingdom. "When do I start?" Paul asked, his voice firmer now. "Immediately," Richard replied, pushing a folder across the desk. "These are your new access credentials, and Paul—" He paused significantly. "I trust your absolute discretion in this matter." As he left the office, Paul felt the weight of the documents found in the dead file on his conscience. In his hands, he now had the power to expose the questionable practices of Miller Enterprises' past. But was that the right path? Or was there a larger, more complex story that still needed to be uncovered? What Paul didn't know was that, in another part of the city, someone else was very interested in his recent promotion. In a discreet office, a shadowy figure examined a photo of him leaving the Miller Enterprises building. "So Miller finally put our man in the position we wanted," he muttered to himself, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. Helen Miller adjusted her glasses as she examined the spreadsheets on her laptop. As corporate counsel and Richard Miller's only daughter, she had privileged access to the most sensitive information of Miller Enterprises. However, something in the numbers before her didn't make sense. "Dad," she called, entering Richard's office without ceremony. "We need to talk about Easy Credit's movements." Richard, who was in a video conference, gestured for a minute. Helen settled into one of the armchairs, observing her father with clinical attention. At 58, Richard maintained his imposing posture as always, but small signs of concern were visible. To those who knew him well, the slightly loose tie, fingers drumming on the desk, the occasionally lost gaze. "Sorry, sweetie," he said after ending the call. "What do you want to talk about?" "I found some inconsistencies in Easy Credit's records. Transfers without clear justification, contracts with questionable clauses, operations that border on illegality." Helen opened her laptop, showing a series of documents. "This could compromise the entire holding if it goes public." Richard stood up. walking to the window that occupied the entire wall. The Chicago sky was heavy, heralding another storm. Helen, there are aspects of business that are complex. Not everything is black and white like they teach in law school. Don't give me that, Dad. I've been a lawyer for 10 years, 5 of them dealing with international mergers and acquisitions. I know how to recognize when something is wrong. She closed the laptop with more force than necessary. What's going on? First those mysterious sabotages, now this. Thunder rumbled in the distance, making the windows vibrate slightly. Richard turned to face his daughter, his face a mask of concern. I hired someone to investigate the sabotages. Paul Sanders from the financial department. Paul Sanders, Helen frowned. The employee you hired 6 months ago? Why him? He has a different eye for numbers, Helen, and sometimes we need someone from outside to see what's right under our noses. Helen studied her father for a moment. There was something he wasn't telling her, she could feel it. 15 years of professional coexistence with Richard had sharpened her ability to read between the lines. Does it have anything to do with Grandpa Albert, with what happened in '85? Richard visibly paled. How do you know about '85? I found some old documents while researching. Mentions of a certain Edward Vasquez, the bankruptcy of Vasquez Enterprises. Helen paused, observing her father's reaction. The same Vasquez who recently reappeared as a consultant for our biggest competitor. Richard returned to his desk, opening a drawer and pulling out an old yellowed photo. In it, 2 young men smiled at the camera, Richard and Edward Vasquez, arms over each other's shoulders, in front of a commercial building. Edward was my best friend, Richard began, his voice laden with emotion. We grew up together, dreamed together. When I inherited control of Miller Enterprises from your grandfather, it was natural for Edward to become my right-hand man. What happened? A series of misguided decisions. Edward started doing side deals, using company resources for personal projects. When I found out the damage was already immense, I had to choose between saving the company or our friendship. Helen processed the information in silence. As a lawyer, she was used to dealing with business disputes, but this was different. It was personal. It was family. And now he's back. Working for Thompson and Associates, she concluded. Just when we start facing internal problems. I don't believe in coincidences, Helen. Not at this level. Richard put the photo back in the drawer. That's why I need you to work with Paul. He has full access to financial documents, but he needs someone with your legal knowledge to understand all the implications. Helen hesitated. Something in the story didn't fit completely, but she couldn't identify exactly what. Okay, I'll talk to him, but Dad, she stood up, adjusting her blazer, if I find out you're hiding something from me. Helen, Richard interrupted her, trust me, everything I've done to protect our family. As she left her father's office, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to unearth secrets that might be better left buried. In the corridor, her heels echoed on the marble floor as she headed to her office, determined to find out more about Paul Sanders and his mysterious hiring. Paul stared at the computer screen with growing unease. After 3 weeks of investigating Miller Enterprises' financial inconsistencies, he began to perceive a disturbing pattern. The sabotages weren't random. They followed a precise logic, as if the person responsible intimately knew the company's inner workings. Excuse me, a female voice interrupted him. Paul Sanders? He looked up to find Helen Miller standing at his office door. Even though he had never spoken directly to her, Paul immediately recognized her from photos in newspapers and business magazines. Ms. Miller, he stood up hastily. How can I help you? Please, just Helen, she entered, closing the door behind her. My father told me about your investigation. I came to offer help. Paul felt a chill down his spine. The lawyer's presence complicated his plans, especially considering the compromising documents he had found about easy credit. I appreciate the offer, but I don't know if... It's not an offer, Paul, Helen interrupted him, sitting down uninvited. It's a necessity. You have the financial knowledge, I have the legal. We need to work together. Something in her tone, professional but with a hint of urgency, caught Paul's attention. Have you discovered something? Helen hesitated for a moment, as if assessing how much she could reveal. I discovered unsettling connections between Miller Enterprises' past and current problems. Paul shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His own discoveries about easy credit weighed on his conscience. Should he share this information with Helen? Edward Vasquez, Helen continued. Does that name mean anything to you? Paul frowned. Vasquez. It appeared in some old documents. I found. Was he an executive of the group? More than that. He was my father's best friend until 1985. Helen leaned forward. The same year Easy Credit was founded. Paul's heart raced. 1985, the year his own father started facing financial problems, the beginning of the spiral that would eventually lead to his own crisis years later. Helen, he began, choosing his words carefully, if I show you something, do you promise to keep absolute secrecy? She nodded gravely. Paul opened a folder on his computer, revealing the documents he had found in the dead file. As Helen read, her expression changed from professional interest to genuine concern. This is much worse than I imagined, she murmured, scanning the predatory contracts. But there's something strange here. These signatures. What about them? They're not my father's, Helen pointed to the screen. I know his signature like the back of my hand. This is different, subtly different. Paul felt a shiver. Are you suggesting someone forged your father's signature? Not just that, Helen opened her bag, pulling out some documents. Look at these recent transfers, the contracts that disappeared. The pattern is the same as 1985, as if the same person was... A noise in the corridor interrupted her. Heavy footsteps were approaching. Helen quickly put away the documents, while Paul closed the windows on his computer. The door opened, revealing Mark Bueno, the group's financial director and Paul's immediate superior. His small, cunning eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on Helen. Ms. Miller, I didn't know you were here, he commented, his honeyed voice carrying a note of distrust. Just clarifying some legal doubts with Paul, Mark, Helen responded with a professional smile. Nothing major. Of course, of course. Mark turned to Paul. I need that audit report by the end of the day. Yes, sir, it's almost ready. After Mark left, Helen and Paul exchanged significant looks. I don't trust him, Helen whispered. Something about Mark always seemed off. I don't trust him. Either, Paul agreed. And after what we discovered today, we need to be more careful. Helen stood up. I'll investigate more about Vasquez in 1985. You continue tracking current financial movements. We'll meet tomorrow, but not here. Too risky. As he watched Helen leave, Paul felt the weight of the conspiracy they were beginning to unravel. The connections between past and present, between his own history and that of the Miller family, were becoming increasingly complex and disturbing. What neither of them knew was that their conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. In a security room in the building's basement, someone was carefully observing the security camera footage, a crooked smile forming on their lips as they made notes in a worn notebook. The Maple Leaf Cafe in the Gold Coast neighborhood was famous for its discretion. Executives and politicians often chose its reserved tables for conversations that required privacy. On that Saturday morning, Helen Miller waited at one of these tables, an untouched cup of espresso in front of her. Paul arrived punctually at 9 a.m., carrying a folder under his arm. He wore jeans and a dress shirt, a conscious attempt to look casual, though his tense expression betrayed the importance of the meeting. Did you manage to discover anything about Vasquez? Paul asked, after the waitress walked away with his order. Helen took a tablet from her purse, sliding it across the table. Edward Vasquez hasn't just resurfaced as a consultant for Thompson & Associates. He's been discreetly buying Miller Enterprises shares through shell companies for the past 3 years. Paul examined the documents on the tablet. His eyes copy retry Claude's response was limited as it hit the maximum length allowed at this time, widening. This represents almost 12% of the group. How did no one notice? The purchases were made by different companies, apparently unconnected. I only noticed the pattern when I started investigating more deeply. Helen leaned forward, lowering her voice. But that's not all. Remember those forged signatures we found? Paul nodded, taking out his own folder. About that, I made some interesting discoveries. He spread some documents on the table, taking care to keep them out of sight of other customers. All of Easy Credit's operations followed a specific pattern. Loans were offered to struggling business people with initially attractive rates. Like traps, Helen murmured, studying the papers. Exactly. But here's the interesting part. After 6 months, when the rates increased dramatically, the debtors' companies were acquired by a holding called VE Holdings. Helen frowned. VE Vasquez Enterprises? Precisely. Edward Vasquez wasn't just using Easy Credit to ruin entrepreneurs. He was building his own empire in the shadows of Miller Enterprises. A distant thunder made Helen look up at the sky, which was rapidly darkening. But why would my father allow this? It doesn't make sense. Unless, Paul hesitated, your father didn't know. What if Vasquez was operating without Richard's knowledge, using Miller Enterprises' structure for his own ends? Helen took out her phone, opening an old photo. Look at this. It's from my father's wedding, 1987. In the image, Richard and Edward smiled side by side. My father always said Vasquez was like a brother to him. What could have happened to destroy a friendship like that? Paul felt a knot in his stomach. His own history with debts and the unexpected help from Richard began to make more sense, or perhaps less. Helen, I think we need to consider the possibility that a sudden movement at a nearby table interrupted him. A man in a dark suit stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. For a moment, his eyes met Paul's and mutual recognition passed between them. We need to get out of here, Paul whispered urgently, beginning to collect the documents. Now. Helen, noticing the change in his tone, didn't question. She quickly put away her tablet and left some bills on the table to pay the check. As they headed for the exit, she noticed 2 more men getting up from different tables. My car is in the underground parking, she murmured, keeping her voice calm as they crossed the cafe. The rain had started to fall when they reached the parking lot. Helen unlocked her BMW with the remote, and both quickly got in. Through the rear-view mirror, they saw the 3 men emerging from the stairwell. Who were they? Helen asked, maneuvering the car towards the exit. The first one, he was there the night your father helped me. He was one of the debt collectors. Paul held the folder tightly against his chest, but now he looked very different. The suit, the posture. They weren't just debt collectors, were they? Helen asked, though she already knew the answer. No. I think we just confirmed that there's much more to this story than it appears. Paul looked at her. And I think your father knew this when he hired me. Helen guided the car through the now rain-washed streets, her mind working furiously. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the image they formed was disturbing. We need to talk to my father, she decided, making a sharp turn. Now. What they didn't know was that at that exact moment, Richard Miller was having his own disturbing revelation. In his office at Miller Enterprises, he stared at an envelope he had just received. Inside was a single photograph, himself on that rainy night 6 months ago, helping Paul Sanders. On the back, a handwritten message. The plan is in motion, phase 1 complete. Richard Miller rarely came to the office on Saturdays, but this was no ordinary morning. The envelope on his desk had changed everything. His hands trembled slightly as he reread the message on the back of the photo, recalling every detail of that rainy night. The intercom buzzed, startling him. Sir, the security guard's voice sounded tense. Your daughter is here with Mr. Sanders. They say it's urgent. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Send them up, Carl. While he waited, he took an old key from his pocket and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, a red folder sealed for decades awaited. It's time, he murmured to himself. Helen burst through the door first, Paul right behind her. Both were wet from the rain and visibly agitated. Dad, we need to talk about Edward Vasquez, Helen began, but stopped when she saw the expression on Richard's face. What's wrong? Richard pushed the envelope with the photograph towards them. Helen picked up the photo, her eyes widening as she recognized the scene. Paul, looking over her shoulder, paled. It wasn't a coincidence, was it? Paul asked. his voice laden with bitterness. "That night, you finding me?" "No," Richard answered, surprising both with his frankness. "It wasn't a coincidence, but not in the way you're thinking." He opened the red folder, spreading its contents on the desk. Old documents, yellowed photographs, newspaper clippings. A story buried for 3 decades began to emerge. In 1985, Edward and I were more than partners. We were brothers in all but blood. Miller Enterprises was growing rapidly, and we needed capital for expansion. Richard picked up an old photo showing him and Edward in front of a bank. That's when Edward suggested a new financial arm for the group. "Easy Credit," Helen completed. "Yes, but I didn't know how Edward was really operating the company. He used my name, my signature, to create predatory loan schemes. When I found out," Richard ran his hand over his face, suddenly looking aged. "Your grandfather, my father, was among the victims." Paul sat heavily in one of the chairs. "My father too. The loan he took out in 85. "Exactly." Richard looked directly at Paul. "When I discovered what Edward was doing, I tried to stop him, but he had documents, contracts with my signature, forged but convincing enough. It was my word against his. And you chose to protect the company," Helen concluded. "I chose to protect the families that depended on Miller Enterprises, hundreds of employees, suppliers." Richard picked up another document from the folder. But Edward didn't give up. He continued operating in the shadows, building his own empire through VE Holdings. "The men at the cafe," Paul said suddenly. "They work for Vasquez?" Richard nodded. Edward never stopped watching Miller Enterprises. He waited, planned, cultivated allies within the company itself. The recent sabotages are just the tip of the iceberg. "That's why you hired me," Paul realized. "Because I had a personal connection to all of this. Because my own story was intertwined with Easy Credit." "Yes, but also because you had something no one else had. The perspective of someone who lived through the consequences of these schemes." Richard stood up, walking to the window. The rain was now falling heavily over Chicago. "When I saw you that night, I recognized the same expression my father had when he lost everything. I couldn't let history repeat itself." Helen approached, her father placing a hand on his shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Shame, perhaps, or fear that you would judge me for the mistakes of the past." Richard turned to face her. "But now Edward is making his final move. That photo," he pointed to the envelope on the desk, "is a message. He wants me to know he's in control." "He's not," Paul said firmly, surprising everyone. "Not anymore. We have the documents, the proof of the forgeries. We can expose everything." "It's not that simple," Helen argued. "If we do that, the scandal could destroy Miller Enterprises. Thousands of jobs would be lost." Richard returned to his desk, picking up one more document from the red folder. "Maybe. There's another way out. Something Edward never knew about." He paused, studying the paper in his hands. "Something I've kept all these years for an emergency like this." A particularly loud thunderclap made the windows shudder. On Richard's desk, the intercom buzzed again. "Sir," the security guard's voice was even tenser than before. "Edward Vasquez is here, and he's not alone." The sound of footsteps in the corridor echoed like a harbinger of the imminent confrontation. Richard quickly tucked the document he was holding inside his jacket, making a silent gesture for Paul and Helen to remain calm. The door opened and Edward Vasquez entered, with the familiarity of someone who had been there hundreds of times before. At 58, he maintained the same elegant posture that characterized him in his youth, although his hair was now completely gray. Behind him, Mark Bueno, the financial director, entered with a satisfied smile on his face. "Richard, my old friend," Edward spoke, his voice smooth as velvet. "It's been a while. Helen, you're as beautiful as ever. And Paul Sanders." He smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Our newest financial investigator." "How did you—" Paul began, but Edward interrupted him with a gesture. "Please, don't insult my intelligence. I know everything that happens at Miller Enterprises. I always have." He walked to Richard's desk, picking up the photograph that was still on it. "Beautiful record, isn't it? Almost poetic, the great Richard Miller saving another lost soul on the streets of Chicago." Helen took a step forward. "What do you want, Edward?" "Straight to the point, like your father." Edward sat comfortably in one of the armchairs. What I want is simple. I want back what's rightfully mine. Richard remained silent, observing his old friend with an unreadable expression. Edward continued, his voice taking on a harder tone. 30 years, Richard. 30 years planning, waiting, building my comeback. Did you really think I had given up? That I would peacefully accept being pushed out of the company I helped build? You weren't pushed out, Richard finally spoke. You betrayed everyone's trust. You used easy credit to destroy innocent people. Destroy? Edward laughed, a humorless sound. I created opportunities. Those businessmen were weak, incompetent. I merely accelerated the inevitable. Paul felt his blood boil. My father wasn't weak. He was an honest man who trusted the wrong people. Ah, yes, your father. Edward turned to Paul. Do you know why Richard really helped you that night? Guilt. Pure and simple guilt over what happened to your father. It wasn't a coincidence you were there. I made sure of it. Helen quickly looked at Mark, who remained near the door with an increasingly wide smile. You were behind this from the beginning. The debt collectors, Paul's debt. Brilliant as always, Helen. Edward clapped softly. Yes, I orchestrated everything. I knew your father wouldn't resist the temptation to help someone in the same situation Albert Miller faced years ago. And I knew Paul, with his personal history, would be the perfect investigator to uncover the irregularities I planted. The sabotages, Richard concluded, you used Mark to create a false trail. Not so false, Mark finally spoke. Just directed. Every document Paul found, every clue Helen followed, everything led exactly where we wanted. Edward stood up, adjusting his impeccable suit. And now we've reached the grand finale. I have 12% of Miller Enterprises shares through shell companies. Mark controls another 7% through fronts, with the proxies we've secured from other minor shareholders. You have the power to call an extraordinary assembly, Helen completed, her voice trembling slightly. Exactly, and with the evidence we have about Easy Credit's irregular operations, all with your father's signature, I can ensure the board votes for his removal, Richard. Richard remained impassive, his hand unconsciously touching the document tucked in his jacket. Edward interpreted his silence as defeat. It doesn't have to end this way. Edward softened his voice. Resign voluntarily. Leave Miller Enterprises under my management. You can keep some shares, have a comfortable retirement. And if I refuse? Then the evidence of Easy Credit's activities goes to the press. Your reputation, the Miller legacy. All destroyed. Edward paused dramatically. And this time, old friend, it won't just be your company at stake. Your daughter is the group's lawyer. How do you think the Bar Association will react when they find out she concealed evidence of illegal activities? Helen paled but stood firm. Paul watched the scene with growing tension, his mind working furiously to find a way out. Richard finally moved, reaching for the document in his jacket. You were always brilliant, Edward, but you had one flaw. You always underestimated others. What are you talking about? You're not the only one who kept documents all these years. Richard placed a yellowed envelope on the desk. I suggest you read this before making any move. Edward picked up the envelope with visible hesitation as the rain continued to lash the office windows. The fate of Miller Enterprises, and everyone present, depended on the contents of that long-guarded document. The silence in the office was absolute as Edward read the document. His hands, always steady, began to tremble slightly. His face, previously confident, gradually lost color. Impossible, he muttered, looking at Richard with a mixture of disbelief and anger. This can't be true. But it is, Richard replied, calmly. Signed and notarized by your own father, Frank Vasquez, in 1984. Helen and Paul exchanged confused glances. Mark, still near the door, took a step forward, eager to understand what had shaken his mentor so much. What does the document say? Helen asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Richard kept his eyes fixed on Edward as he answered. Frank Vasquez was more than a family friend. He was the true owner of Vasquez Enterprises, and before his departure he left specific instructions about the company's fate. Edward let the papers fall on the desk, his elegant pose completely undone. My father never told me. Because he knew how you would react, Richard completed. Frank foresaw everything. He saw your unbridled ambition, your willingness to step over anyone to achieve your goals. That's why he left Vasquez Enterprises under my guardianship, not yours. Lies! Edward slammed his fist on the desk. The company was mine by right, not according to this document. Frank gave me legal power to prevent the company from being used unethically. When I discovered what you were doing with Easy Credit, I had no choice. Helen picked up the document, her eyes quickly scanning the pages. This changes everything, she murmured. With this, we can prove that Edward had no legal authority to conduct those operations. And more, Paul added, understanding the dimension of the revelation. All the shell companies you used to buy Miller Enterprises shares, they're extensions of Vasquez Enterprises, aren't they? Edward fell heavily into an armchair, his previous arrogance completely dissipated. Mark, realizing the game had turned, began to discreetly retreat towards the door. Not so fast, Mark, Richard called without taking his eyes off Edward. Helen, do you have those documents about the suspicious transfers? Helen nodded, taking her tablet from her bag. All the irregular operations of the last 3 years, documented and dated, including those that prove our financial director's involvement. You have a choice, Edward. Richard stood up, his voice carrying the weight of decades of shared history. We can resolve this the hard way, with lawsuits, scandals, and consequences for everyone. Or we can find a middle ground. Middle ground? Edward laughed bitterly. After everything you hid from me? Hide. I tried to protect you. Your father knew you weren't ready to take on the responsibility of a business empire. He wanted you to learn, to grow. Protect me? Edward abruptly stood up. You destroyed my life. No, Edward. Richard's voice softened. You did that yourself. Every scheme, every betrayal, every person you harmed, those were your choices. Paul took a step forward. Just as they were my choices that led me to that rainy night. And your choices that brought you here. A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the rain began to diminish, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. What do you propose? Edward finally asked, his voice carrying a defeat that no one there had ever witnessed. A fresh start, Richard answered. Not like we were before, that's impossible. But we can build something new. Use Vasquez Enterprises' resources to help struggling companies, not destroy them. Helen saw the opportunity. We could create a business recovery program, something legitimate, transparent. With proper oversight, of course, Paul added, looking significantly at Mark, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Edward remained silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the city sprawling below. 30 years of bitterness and planning, crumbling in a single morning. And if I refuse, then I'll use your father's document, along with all the evidence we've collected, to ensure you never get close to the corporate world again, Richard replied simply. The sun now shone brightly through the windows, illuminating the room with an almost painful clarity. Edward Vasquez, the man who had dedicated 3 decades of his life to revenge, now faced his greatest decision. On Richard's desk, the intercom buzzed again. Sir, the security guard's voice sounded hesitant. The board members have started arriving for the extraordinary meeting. Richard looked at his old friend. What will it be, Edward? Revenge or redemption? Edward's response would change not just the fate of Miller Enterprises, but the lives of everyone present in that room. And as the city outside awakened to a new day, old wounds finally began to heal. The silence in the Miller Enterprises boardroom was deafening. The 15 board members waited tensely while Richard Miller stood before them, Edward Vasquez at his side. Helen and Paul occupied chairs near the window, closely observing the scene unfolding. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, Richard began, his firm voice echoing through the room. I called this extraordinary meeting to announce significant changes in our corporate structure. The board members shifted in their chairs, exchanging apprehensive glances. In recent days, rumors about a hostile takeover attempt had circulated through the company's corridors. As you know, Miller Enterprises has always prided itself on its history of innovation and adaptation to the times. Today, we take another step in that direction. Richard paused, briefly looking at Edward. "I'm pleased to announce the creation of a new division, the Vasquez Miller Institute for Business Restructuring." A murmur of surprise swept through the room. Edward stepped forward, and for the first time in decades, his smile was genuine. "The Institute," Edward continued, "will be a partnership between Miller Enterprises and Vasquez Enterprises. Our goal is to identify struggling companies and offer not just financial support, but also strategic consulting for their recovery." Helen stood up, holding a folder of documents. "As the project's legal director, I can guarantee that all operations will be conducted with full transparency and within the most rigorous ethical standards." One of the oldest board members, John Pearson, raised his hand. "What about the rumors of irregularities, the allegations about easy credit?" "Excellent question," Paul intervened, also standing up. "As part of the restructuring, easy credit will be completely overhauled. All old contracts will be reviewed, and cases of abuse will be rectified." Richard observed with satisfaction as the board absorbed the information. The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by genuine interest in the new project. "But there's more," Richard continued. "The Institute won't just be a financial institution. We'll create a center for studies and research on business recovery, offering scholarships and mentoring programs for young entrepreneurs." Edward picked up a remote control, activating the projector. On the screen, detailed financial graphs and projections appeared. "Our studies indicate significant market potential. There are thousands of companies in the United States that could benefit from a structured recovery program." As the presentation continued, Helen couldn't help but notice the transformation in Edward. The bitter and vengeful man of recent weeks seemed to have given way to someone closer to the young idealist her father had admired so much in the past. "Total transparency policy," Edward emphasized, reaching the end of his presentation. "Each operation will be documented and audited by independent firms. We won't repeat past mistakes." The chairman of the board, a white-haired gentleman named Albert Thompson, cleared his throat. "And the management? What will the administrative structure be like?" Richard smiled. "Edward will be the president of the institute with full operational autonomy. Helen will assume the legal directorship, and Paul Sanders will be our director of compliance and risk management." Paul felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. From desperate debtor to director in less than a year, life had a peculiar sense of irony. "And Mark Bueno?" another board member asked. "Mr. Bueno submitted his resignation this morning," Helen responded diplomatically, omitting the details of the evidence they had collected about his participation in previous schemes. The vote that followed was almost a formality. The board unanimously approved the creation of the Institute and the new organizational structure. When the meeting ended, Richard observed with satisfaction as the board members congratulated Edward, many expressing interest in personally participating in the project. "It worked better than we expected," Helen murmured to her father as she organized her documents. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people just need a second chance." Richard looked significantly at Edward, who was now animatedly conversing with some board members. "And a reason to do the right thing." Paul approached the group, holding his cell phone. "I just received an interesting message. The Chamber of Commerce wants to schedule a meeting to discuss possible partnerships with the Institute." "Already?" Helen smiled. "News travels fast." "And this is just the beginning," Richard replied, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and relief. "The real work starts now." Outside, the afternoon sun bathed Chicago in golden hues. In the boardroom, old rivalries gave way to new. Dreams and the future, for the first time in a long time, seemed bright with possibilities. 3 months after the creation of the Vasquez Miller Institute, the project's headquarters occupied 2 entire floors of a modern commercial building in the heart of the Loop. On that particular morning, Paul Sanders watched from the window of his new office as a line of entrepreneurs waited in the lobby for evaluation interviews. "Impressive, isn't it?" Helen entered without knocking, carrying a stack of files. "We already have over 200 requests for assistance." Paul smiled, remembering his own situation less than a year ago. "And each of these people has a story, a family depending on the success of their business. That's why we need to do this right, Edward commented, also entering the room. In recent months, his countenance had changed significantly. The lines of bitterness on his face had softened, replaced by an expression of renewed purpose. Helen sat in one of the chairs, flipping through her documents. The first case we approved is already showing positive results. Mr. Johnson's bakery has increased revenue by 40% after restructuring. And not just financially, Paul added. He managed to keep all his employees and even hired 2 more. Edward approached the window, observing the city he had once planned to dominate through revenge. You know, I never thought helping people could be more satisfying than destroying them. Your father knew. A familiar voice sounded from the door. Richard Miller entered the room carrying an old folder. That's why he left that document. He believed that one day you would find your true path. The atmosphere in the room subtly changed. Despite the reconciliation, moments of vulnerability between Richard and Edward were still rare. I found something interesting in the old archives, Richard continued, opening the folder. Your father's original plan for Vasquez Enterprises. It was very similar to what we're doing now with the Institute. Edward carefully took the papers, as if they were a sacred relic. His eyes scanned the yellowed pages, recognizing his father's handwriting. He was always a visionary, Edward murmured. I just couldn't see it. Helen watched the scene with interest. In a few months, she had witnessed a remarkable transformation, not just in the companies, but mainly in the people involved. The most important thing is what we do from here on out, Paul commented, picking up a report from his desk. I just received the data from the latest survey. 92% of the entrepreneurs who sought our help said they feel more hopeful about the future. Richard smiled, remembering the rainy night he found Paul. Hope, sometimes that's all people need to start over. Along with a little professional help, Helen added with a smile. Edward carefully put his father's documents back in the folder. Richard, do you think he would be proud of what we're doing here? I'm sure he would, Richard replied, placing a hand on his old friend's shoulder. Frank always believed in the power of redemption. An employee knocked on the door, interrupting. The moment. Dr. Sanders, your daughter is at the reception. Paul checked his watch, surprised. That's right, I promised to take Anna for lunch today. She's curious to see the Institute. Bring her here, Helen suggested. She must be proud of her father. As Paul left to fetch his daughter, the others remained in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. You know, Edward finally spoke, I spent 30 years planning to destroy all of this. And now, for the first time, I feel like I'm really building something worthwhile. Helen approached the window, observing the movement on the street below. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find our true purpose. Richard nodded, thinking about how a simple decision on a rainy night had triggered a series of events that would change so many lives. Paul returned with Anna, his 12-year-old daughter, who looked in wonder at the modern office. Her bright eyes and innocent smile reminded everyone in the room of the true meaning of their work, creating a better future, one story at a time. So this is the famous Anna, Edward smiled, extending his hand to the girl. Your father talks about you a lot. Is it true that you help people with problems? Anna asked, her childlike curiosity provoking smiles. Yes, Helen answered. We help people rebuild their dreams. Richard observed the scene with satisfaction. The empire his father had built, that he had expanded, and that had almost been destroyed by bitterness and revenge, had found a new purpose. And perhaps, he thought, this had always been the true legacy he should leave. It was a Thursday afternoon when Helen Miller received an unexpected phone call. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice transported her back to the beginning of this whole story. Ms. Miller, this is Tony, one of the security guards at the Hancock Tower. You need to see something. Intrigued, Helen went down to the building's dead file, where she had found the first documents that revealed the truth about Easy Credit. Tony was waiting for her with a dusty box in his hands. We found this during the archive reorganization, he explained, handing over the box. It has your grandfather's name on it. Back in her office, Helen carefully opened the box. Inside, she found a personal diary of Albert Miller, her grandfather, dated 1985. The yellowed pages contained not just financial records, but also deep reflections on business ethics and social responsibility. "Dad," she called, dialing Richard's extension. "You need to see this." Minutes later, Richard, Edward, and Paul were gathered in her office. Albert Miller's diary revealed a surprising vision of the past. "Edward is brilliant," Helen read aloud, "but his ambition blinds him. Richard has his heart in the right place, but sometimes he's too naive. I need to find a way to protect the legacy we've built without destroying their friendship." Edward closed his eyes, the words from the past hitting him like arrows. "Albert was always more of a father to me than a mentor." Richard picked up the diary, flipping to the last pages. "Today, I made the hardest decision of my life," he read. "I instructed Frank Vasquez on how to proceed. I can't allow greed to destroy everything we've built. Money without purpose is poison for the soul." "Your father and my father," Edward murmured. "They planned everything. The guardianship document, the separation of the companies. They wanted to protect us," Richard completed, "from ourselves." Paul, who had been observing the scene in silence, finally spoke. "It's amazing how the past continues to teach us. This morning, I received a thank you letter from one of the entrepreneurs we helped. He said that for the first time in years he slept through the night without worrying about debts." Helen smiled, remembering other success stories from the Institute. "Mrs. Martinez from the clothing factory in Pilsen. We not only managed to restructure her debt but also modernize her production. Now she's exporting to Canada. And most importantly," Edward added, "we're doing it the right way, no shortcuts, no schemes." Richard carefully closed the diary. "I think this is what my father and Frank wanted from the beginning. Not just financial success, but a legacy of transformation." At that moment, Christina, the Institute's new executive assistant, rushed into the office. "Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." She turned on the wall-mounted TV. On the main business news channel, a special report showed the impact of the Vasquez Miller Institute on the recovery of small and medium-sized businesses. "The innovative project," the reporter narrated, "has already assisted more than 300 companies in just 4 months of operation. The success rate in restructurings is an impressive 85%. The camera showed emotional testimonials from entrepreneurs who had gone through the program. Among them, Paul recognized familiar faces, people who, like him, had found a second chance. "That reminds me," Helen commented, turning off the TV. "We received an interesting invitation. The University of Chicago wants to establish a partnership, create an extension program in business recovery." "Perfect timing," Edward smiled. "I was just thinking about expanding our educational area." "And that's not all," Paul added, picking up a folder from his desk. 3 major banks have shown interest in replicating our risk analysis model. They want to create specific departments for business recovery." Richard observed the group with pride. In a few months, they had transformed a story of revenge and resentment into something truly meaningful. "You know," he said, "I found some old notes from my father about the meaning of success. He wrote that true success isn't measured by the size of the bank account, but by the number of lives we manage to positively impact." "He was right," Edward agreed, picking up Albert's diary. "It took me 30 years to understand this, but I finally got it." Helen looked out the window at the sun setting over Chicago. The city that had witnessed so many stories of failure and overcoming was now the stage for a greater transformation. "The most interesting thing," she reflected, "is how everything is connected. Paul's story, Edward's revenge, Grandpa's secrets. Everything brought us here." Paul smiled, thinking about his own journey. "Sometimes we need to lose our way to find the right path." At that moment, something in the diary caught Edward's attention. A loose photo between the pages showed him and Richard, still young, next to Albert Miller. On the back, a simple message: "True power lies in transforming lives." The group contemplated the photo in silence, each reflecting on the twists and turns life took. Outside, the city continued its frantic rhythm, but inside that room, an old truth was renewed. The greatest legacy we can leave is the difference we make in the lives of others. The auditorium at the University of Chicago was packed that Monday morning. On stage, Paul Sanders adjusted the microphone, preparing for his first lecture as director of the Vasquez Miller Institute. In the audience, young and attentive faces awaited his words. "My story begins on a rainy night," he began, his voice firm, echoing through the environment. "A night when I had lost all hope." In the front row, Helen smiled encouragingly. Beside her, Richard and Edward watched with evident pride the man who had somehow been instrumental in their own transformations. "But this isn't just my story," Paul continued. "It's the story of thousands of American entrepreneurs who, every day, face the challenge of keeping their dreams alive." The presentation included real cases of companies recovered by the Institute. Each slide showed not just numbers and graphs, but also the faces and stories behind the statistics. "What we discovered," Paul explained, "is that most business failures don't happen due to lack of competence or dedication. Often, it's the absence of proper guidance at the right moment that leads good companies into crisis." In the audience, business and economics students took notes furiously. Among them were some entrepreneurs who had been specially invited to the event. "The Vasquez Miller Institute isn't just a financial institution," Paul emphasized. "We're a bridge between academic knowledge and market reality." Helen stood up, joining Paul on stage for the legal part of the presentation. "Our partnership with the University of Chicago goes beyond theory. We're creating a mentoring program where students will work directly with companies in the restructuring process." Edward observed with renewed interest. It was hard to believe that just 6 months ago he had been planning to destroy all of this. Now each new project, each success story, fueled his determination to make a difference. After the lecture, a group of students surrounded Paul and Helen with questions. Richard and Edward took the moment for a private conversation. "You know," Edward commented, "yesterday I visited my father's grave, first time in years." Richard looked at his friend with understanding. "And how was it?" "Liberating. I finally understood what he and your father tried to teach us. The true legacy isn't in power or money, but in the impact we cause." At that moment, Anna, Paul's daughter, came running into the auditorium. At 12 years old, she was already a constant presence at the Institute, where she spent afternoons after school, doing homework and observing the adults' work. "Uncle Richard, Uncle Edward," she called excitedly. "Did you see my dad? He was amazing." Edward smiled, picking up the girl. "Your father is a special man, Anna. He taught us a lot about new beginnings." Helen approached the group, still answering questions from some persistent students. "The university wants to establish a permanent center for studies in business recovery. They want the Institute to be an official partner." "And that's not all," Paul added, finally managing to join them. 3 universities from other states have shown interest in replicating the program. Richard observed the group with satisfaction. It was as if the universe was conspiring to prove that his father and Frank had been right from the beginning. True success was in creating opportunities for others. "Next week, we inaugurate the first branch in New York," Edward reminded them. The governor confirmed his presence. "And the numbers from the last quarter?" Richard asked. "Impressive," Helen replied. 92% of the companies that went through the program are not just surviving but growing. We've indirectly generated more than 1,200 new jobs." Anna, still in Edward's arms, innocently asked, "Does this mean more children will have their parents home early?" The group fell silent for a moment, touched by the simplicity and depth of the question. "Yes, sweetheart," Paul answered, hugging his daughter. "That's exactly what it means." As they left the auditorium, Helen noticed something interesting. "Look," she pointed to a group of students still animatedly discussing. "They're really excited about the idea of using knowledge to help people." "That's how real changes happen," Richard reflected. "One person inspires another, who inspires 10 more, who inspire 100. Edward completed the thought. "And before we realize it, we've created a wave of transformation." The group walked across the university campus, where old trees provided shade for the dreams of new generations. Paul carried Anna on his shoulders, while she played at counting the clouds in the sky. You know what impresses me the most," Helen commented. "How everything started with a seemingly simple decision on a rainy night. There are no simple decisions, Richard replied, smiling. Just moments we choose to make a difference. Edward stopped for a moment, observing the movement of students across the campus. And to think I almost destroyed all this out of revenge. But you didn't, Paul intervened. You chose a different path. That's what we teach at the Institute. There's always another way. Anna, from atop her father's shoulders, declared, with a wisdom unique to children. And this way is much cooler. The group laughed, agreeing with the simplicity of the observation. The afternoon sun painted the Chicago sky with golden hues, as if nature itself was celebrating the transformations they had experienced. A year had passed since that rainy night that had changed so many lives. The Vasquez Miller Institute was preparing for its first award ceremony, recognizing extraordinary cases of business recovery. The event would take place in the same building, where it all began, the Hancock Tower. Helen supervised the final preparations in the main auditorium, now transformed into an elegant event hall. On stage, a loop presentation showed images of the hundreds of companies and families impacted by the Institute's work. Everything's perfect, Paul commented, approaching with a clipboard. Over 400 guests have confirmed their attendance. Including some interesting faces, Helen smiled. Remember Mark Bueno? Paul frowned. Our former financial director? What about him? He asked to participate. Apparently, after leaving Miller Enterprises, he went through a difficult phase. Now he's rebuilding his life with a small consultancy. And you think we should? I've already approved his participation, Edward interrupted, joining the conversation. Everyone deserves a second chance, I should know. Edward's smile no longer had any trace of the bitterness that had characterized him for so many years. His relaxed face and tranquil posture reflected the inner peace he had finally found. Dad, Anna ran through the hall, hugging Paul. Mrs. Martinez from the clothing factory brought a gift for you. Paul took the package his daughter was carrying. Inside was a custom-made suit with a note, "For the man who saved not just my business, but my dignity." Speaking of gifts, Richard entered the hall carrying an old box. I found something you all need to see. The group gathered around one of the tables. Richard carefully opened the box, revealing documents and photographs. These are the original plans of my father and Frank for our companies, he explained. Look at the date, 1984. They were already envisioning something very similar to what we created with the Institute. Edward picked up one of the papers reverently. My father always said that business should serve a greater purpose. I just didn't want to listen. But you listened when it mattered. Helen placed her hand on his shoulder. That's what counts. A commotion at the entrance of the hall caught the group's attention. The first guests were beginning to arrive for the ceremony. Dr. Sanders! A familiar voice called out. It was Joe, the bakery owner who had been one of the Institute's first success cases. I brought a surprise for the party. Behind him, a line of small business owners carried trays and more trays of refreshments. All had been helped by the Institute and were eager to contribute to the celebration. This is, Helen began, moved. Community, Richard completed. This is what we've built here. Not just a business recovery institute, but a true network of mutual support. The night progressed, and the hall filled with stories of overcoming and new beginnings. In one corner, Mark Bueno conversed timidly with some entrepreneurs. In another, university students from the mentoring program exchanged experiences with their mentees. You know what's most impressive? Paul commented to Helen, observing the movement. How each story here is connected to all the others. Like a positive domino effect, she agreed. Each company we help ends up helping others. Edward, who was observing the scene with Richard, smiled. Our fathers would be proud. They knew, Richard replied. They knew that one day we would understand the true meaning of success. Anna, who was playing among the tables with other children of the entrepreneurs present, suddenly stopped in front of one of the screens showing old photos. Dad, come see this. The group approached. On the screen, a black and white photo showed Albert Miller and Frank Vasquez as young men standing in front of a small store. That was the first business they saved together, Richard explained. A grocery store that was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1962. The beginning of everything, Edward murmured. Helen observed the photo for a moment. And now the cycle is complete. Every person in this hall is part of a story that began more than 60 years ago. Paul hugged Anna, thinking about how his own story had become intertwined with that legacy. And it will continue for many generations. Outside, a light rain began to fall on Chicago, just like on that night that had changed everything. But now, instead of despair, the raindrops brought promises of renewal and hope. The sun was rising over Chicago when Helen arrived at the Institute's office on that special morning. It was the day of the inauguration of the 100th unit, now in Seattle, and the beginning of a new phase in the story that had begun with a decision on a rainy night. In the main lobby, an exhibition told this story through photographs and testimonials. The first image showed Richard Miller extending his hand to Paul Sanders under an awning. The last, taken the previous week, showed a room full of young entrepreneurs participating in the mentoring program. "It's amazing how everything has changed," Paul commented, approaching with 2 coffees. He offered one to Helen as they observed the exhibition together. "And at the same time, the essence remains the same," she replied, accepting the coffee. "The idea that there's always hope, always a way." The elevator opened, and Edward rushed out, talking on the phone. "Yes, Senator, the program can be adapted for public policies. In fact, we already have a pilot running in 3 city halls." He gestured a greeting to Helen and Paul, heading to his office. In recent months, the Institute had become a national reference in business recovery, attracting the attention of governments and international organizations. "Who would have thought," Paul smiled, "that the same Edward who almost destroyed everything would now be one of the greatest advocates for struggling businesses?" "People can change," Richard commented, joining them, "when they find a purpose greater than their resentments." Anna, now 13, came running with her school backpack. "Dad, can I stay here this afternoon? I want to help with the school's project." The Institute had recently started a financial education program in public schools, inspired by a suggestion Anna made during a family dinner. "Of course, sweetheart," Paul smiled, "but school first." "She has a natural talent for this," Helen observed after Anna left, skipping towards the elevator, "for seeing potential in people." "Like her father," Richard completed, proud of how his instinct on that rainy night had proven correct. The morning advanced, and the Institute buzzed with its usual routine. In one meeting room, young consultants discussed cases with entrepreneurs. In another, university students presented innovation projects for small businesses. Dr. Sanders, a lady in her 60s, waited timidly at the reception. "My name is Carol. I came to say thank you." Paul recognized her immediately, owner of a small cake factory that had almost closed its doors 6 months earlier. "Mrs. Carroll, how's production going?" "Growing every day," she smiled, her eyes watering. "But I didn't just come to thank you. I want to volunteer as a mentor. Maybe my experience can help others." Helen, who overheard the conversation, felt a lump in her throat. This was how the cycle perpetuated itself. Each person helped became an agent of transformation. In the early afternoon, everyone gathered in the auditorium for the video conference with Seattle. The new unit would be the first in the Pacific Northwest, bringing hope to a part of the country often overlooked. "Before we begin," Richard took the floor, "I want to share something with you." He opened an old folder, taking out a yellowed paper. "This is a letter my father wrote in 1985, addressed to the future." He began to read. "Dear successors, if you're reading this, it's because you finally understood that the true power of business isn't in accumulating wealth, but in transforming lives. Edward, Richard, you're different, but complementary. One has the vision, the other has the heart. Together you can build something extraordinary." Edward, who had never heard these words, had to hold back his emotions. Richard continued, "What we've built here isn't just a business empire. It's a legacy of hope. Each life touched, each dream realized, each family restored. This is true success." Helen took her father's hand while Paul hugged Anna, who had returned from school. "And always remember, the greatest investment we can make is in people, because they are the ones who in the end make the difference." The video conference began, showing smiling faces in Seattle. Another seed was being planted. More lives would be transformed. As the ceremony proceeded, Helen looked out the window. Chicago stretched endlessly under the afternoon sun, a city of millions of stories, millions of dreams. And on every corner, in every small business, there was someone waiting for a second chance. "You know," she whispered to Paul, "I think I finally understood what Grandpa Albert meant by legacy of hope." Paul nodded, watching his daughter, who was now helping a young entrepreneur with a presentation. "It's not about money or power," he replied. "It's about believing that each person has the potential to start over." Outside, rain clouds were again approaching Chicago. But now, when the drops began to fall, they didn't bring fear or despair. They brought promises of renewal, of new beginnings, of reborn dreams. And somewhere, perhaps, Albert Miller and Frank Vasquez were smiling, knowing that their true legacy had finally been realized.